So this week we focused on Assertion by Stolniker. This is an incredibly rich paper full of really different interesting ideas. But one of the centerpieces of the entire paper is an idealized view of communication, of what we're doing when we communicate with each other. And the starring role here is a theory about the role of assertion in that theory of communication. So this works in a number of steps. The way we're going to do this is we're going to first recall what speaker presupposition is, at least in this paper, for Stolniker. We'll see how that's used to define a notion of the common ground. So we already talked about the common ground, but we gave a sort of more or less hand-wavy idea of what that is. Given the notion of speaker presupposition, we can make this more concrete. Once we have that, we can then say what assertion is and zoom out and see, well, what is basically the main theory of communication that's going on here. And finally, once we do that, we can draw out a few principles which, given the view of communication, you might expect assertion to be governed by on Stolniker's theory. Okay, so what is speaker presupposition for Stolniker? Well, according to Stolniker, at least in this paper, a speaker presupposes a particular proposition just in case they believe it, or they act as if they believe it, and they also act as if their audience believes it. So to presuppose something crucially involves something like belief. You believe it, or you act like you believe it, but it also involves beliefs, or what looks like beliefs, about your audience as well. Why is this? So remember when we talked about the intentional theory assertion, we firstly saw that genuine communication seems to involve some notion of transparency. And part of that notion of transparency is the recognition of other people of your intentions. So that was something that happened in the intentional theory of communication. And basically something like the same idea is going on here. What we basically want is for something to be presupposed by a speaker, just in case they take that information to be transparent or public in a certain way to everyone involved in the conversation. And when you think about it like that, then you'll see that speaker presupposition has to involve more than just individual belief. Because if you think not only that something is true, but that information is available to everyone, then presumably you at the very least believe that everyone else believes it, or that they are acting as if they believe it, that they're taking it for granted. So far, speaker presupposition involves these two pieces. You, the speaker, believe it, and that your audience believes it as well. Now, in the official definition of speaker presupposition, we said you act as if you believe it, and you act as if you believe that your audience are acting as if they believe it. Another way for acting as if believing it, you might say that you accept it. So we'll say that you accept a proposition when you act as if you believe it. And an obvious question is, well, why are we stating this in terms of as if belief or acceptance rather than just straightforward belief? And part of the reason is because we want to capture eventually the idea that sometimes information is taken for granted which maybe is not believed by everybody in certain kinds of conversations. So if you think of a conversation where some proposition is up for dispute, but you want to figure out what follows from it. Well, here, even if you don't believe it, you might, for the purposes of the conversation, go along with it, i.e. accept it or act as if you believe it. And because that will then enable you to have a conversation about, well, what would be the case if this proposition held? In a case like that, where we're going along with a proposition, we want to be able to say that that proposition is sort of transparent or public in the same way as things that we might communicate or actually believe. So that's why we're defining speaker presupposition in terms of acceptance or as if believing it. Because sometimes in certain conversations, things will be presupposed by everybody, not because everybody believes them, but rather because they're willing for the sake of that conversation to go along with them. So that's why we have this caveat about how speaker presupposition is being defined. All that being said though, for today we're basically going to set aside this complication and we're going to act as if we're going to ourselves accept that presupposition is just defined straightforwardly in terms of beliefs. So usually we'll slip into thinking of speaker presupposition as saying something like, you believe it and your audience believes it, because we're not going to be focusing on the cases where we want something to be presupposed or common ground without being believed. And once you have speaker presupposition on the table, it's actually quite straightforward to make more concrete this idea of the common ground that we talked about before. So before, when we talked about the common ground, we had this very rough idea of the information that everybody takes for granted. We can say that more precisely and say that the common ground is the set of propositions that are presupposed by everybody in the conversation. So a proposition gets to be taken for granted, it gets to be in the common ground, just in case everybody in the conversation presupposes it. I.e., on the definition we're using at the moment at least, everybody believes it, and everybody believes everybody else believes it. So that's what it takes for a proposition to be common ground on this view. Once we have this idea of the common ground, we can actually define a very important derived notion that we'll see again and again once we think about this theory, which is called the context set. So the context set is a set of worlds, and you should think about it just like you thought about the belief set or the knowledge set when we gave the possible worlds theory of attitudes a long time ago. Because we said we're imagining that propositions are sets of worlds, but that you could represent somebody's belief state in terms of a set of worlds, namely the set of worlds compatible with everything that they believe. And we can actually do exactly the same move here once we have the common ground, because the common ground is a set of propositions. It's a set of propositions that everybody is presupposing. And the context set is a set of worlds, each of which is compatible with every proposition that's in the common ground. So a world is in the context set, corresponding to a certain common ground, just in case it's consistent with all the propositions in the common ground. Now remember again, we're using the possible worlds theory of attitudes and of propositions, so we can actually state the idea of the context set in a slightly simpler way. So we can say that the context set is the result of taking each of the propositions in the common ground and intersecting them. So remember, we saw the operation of intersection is when you have two sets that overlap. Their intersection is the overlap. On this way of thinking about it, the context set is the overlap of all the propositions in the common ground. This again is exactly the same way that things worked for belief. The same relationship holds between the belief set and the propositions believed as holds between the context set and the propositions in the common ground. So you can think of the belief set as the intersection of all the propositions that somebody believes, that's their belief set. The context set is the intersection of all the propositions in the common ground. Before, when we started talking about possible worlds, we saw that you can draw some nice pictures that help illustrate some of the important notions. And those kinds of ideas actually carry over in a very straightforward way to what we're doing today. So as usual, we've got our big square, that's the set of all possible worlds. And we've drawn in the middle this green circle. I'm going to call it C. And this is going to be our context set. So this is, remember, the worlds, all of the worlds that are compatible with everything that's in the common ground, i.e. everything that everybody is presupposing in the conversation. Okay, so that's our context set. And in the same way as we did before, we can just draw very simple pictures of what it is for a proposition to be common ground, what it is for a proposition to be compatible with the common ground, and what it is for a proposition to be ruled out by the common ground. So let's start by drawing a picture of what it takes for something to be accepted in the common ground, or to be part of the common ground. Well, imagine we have a proposition like this, or call it P, which is a superset of the common ground. So every world in the common ground is a world that's in the set P. Put differently, what that means is that proposition P is true in every world in the context set. Now, it's true in more worlds than just that, but it's at least true in all worlds in the context set. But given our definition of what the context set is, i.e. the worlds compatible with everything that's being presupposed, you can see that this is going to mean that P is being presupposed. If P is true in all the worlds compatible with what's being presupposed, then P must itself be being presupposed, given what we're saying. So this is a very simple picture of what it is for a proposition to be part of the common ground. It's for the proposition, the set of worlds it corresponds to include the context set. So that's what it is for a proposition to be part of the common ground. What does it mean for a proposition to be compatible with the common ground? Well, given what we said before about similar notions of compatibility with the belief, the answer, again, is very straightforward. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw yet one more proposition. We'll draw it this way. So this is the blue circle is our new proposition, and I'll call it Q. So what's going on with Q is that it partially overlaps with C, but not entirely. So our new proposition Q doesn't contain C, but it doesn't fall completely outside of C either. There's a region where they overlap, which is here. And this is a picture of what it's like for a proposition to be merely compatible with the common ground. Q is merely compatible with the common ground because it overlaps with the common ground. It's true in some of the worlds in the context set, i.e. it's true in some of the worlds that are compatible with everything that's being presupposed. So that's a picture of what it means for a proposition to be compatible with the context set. The final question is, well, what does it take for a proposition to be ruled out by the context set? And actually, we don't even need to draw anything new to see this. So we've already drawn the circle corresponding to P. So all the worlds inside this black circle, those are the P worlds. What about the not P worlds? Where do those fall in the diagram? Well, we already know the answer to that given what we said in the first few weeks. If these are the P worlds, then everything outside of that is a not P world. So I'll just make that a little bit clearer. So everything in this shaded black region, anything in here is a not P world. So once we've drawn P, we've automatically thereby also drawn not P. Not P is all of this area. And once we've identified not P, we can also very easily see, well, what is it for the common ground to rule out a certain proposition? Because this is a picture where the common ground rules out not P. And the reason is because the context set falls entirely outside the not P region. These are all the not P worlds. We can see that there's no overlap between the region of the context set and the not P worlds. That must mean that all of the context set worlds are worlds where not P is false, i.e. everybody in the context presupposes that P is false. So for a proposition to be ruled out by the common ground is just for the context set to fall entirely outside the region where that proposition is true. The reason why the context set is helpful is because it gives us a very nice picture of what the effect of asserting something is. So we have the idea of the speaker presupposition, we have the idea of common ground. We can now, that we've got these two notions plus the derived notion of context set in place, say what the theory of assertion is. And the theory of assertion is basically this, that when you assert something, what you're doing is you're proposing to add a proposition to the common ground. If I assert the proposition it's raining, that is a proposal to add the proposition to the common ground. The common ground is a set of propositions. I'm proposing we add yet one more proposition. It's important to notice that it's a proposal, so whether or not it's successful, whether or not that proposition actually does get added to the common ground, depends on what happens with the other people in the conversation. If they reject that assertion, then the proposition will not enter the common ground. But if it does get accepted, then it enters the common ground. And here it's worth noticing that whether something gets accepted or rejected is not necessarily something particularly fancy or not. We know that the common ground is determined in terms of speaker presuppositions. So basically, to say that a proposition enters the common ground or not is just to say something about what happens to speakers' presuppositions. So if a proposition enters the common ground, what that means is the presuppositions of the speakers have changed. In particular, they've come to believe the proposition probably, and they've come to believe that you believe it as well. And that looks like it should, because it does look like one effect of assertion when I accept your assertion is that I come to believe it, and indeed I also come to believe that you accept it. So that's the theory of assertion. Assertion is a proposal to add a proposition to the common ground. What that means, given what we've said about the common ground, is for the attitudes of the people in the conversation to change in such a way. It's for that proposition to become presupposed by everybody, i.e. believed by everybody, and believed to be believed by everybody. Now, I said the context set is helpful in understanding exactly what's going on here. And the reason why this is because Once you have this idea of the context set, this gives you a very nice picture of what happens when you assert something. So we said the context set is a set of worlds that represents the set of presuppositions in the context. A world is in the context set just in case it's compatible with everything that's being presupposed. On this picture, the effect of assertion is to narrow down the context set, to make it smaller. So if this seems confusing, just remember from the beginning, we said that as sets of worlds get smaller, that represents the fact that your information is getting bigger and bigger. So a smaller set of worlds represents more information. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that is true, and if you think about it, you'll see why it's true. So using the context set, we can think about communication as narrowing down the context set, and that's exactly what assertions do if they're successful, if they're accepted. An assertion narrows down the context set. It makes the context set smaller. And the particular way it does that is that, well, we take the proposition that you're asserting. We know that corresponds to a set of worlds because that's our view of propositions. And what happens is that you just intersect the proposition with your context set. So if you have an old context set and I want to update it, for instance, with the proposition that it's raining, what happens if I'm successful in getting that assertion to be accepted is that we end up with a new context set, which is all the worlds that were both in the old context set and are ones where it's raining. So put differently, the effect of an assertion is to intersect the proposition that you're asserting with your old context set. So the overlap between the context set and the proposition that you're asserting, that's the new context set if the assertion is successful. Okay, so we have speaker presupposition, we have common ground, now we have a theory of assertion. But if we zoom out, we can begin to see that there is a general theory of what's going on in communication here. Because basically the picture is that, at least in idealized cases, what's happening is that when we're having a conversation, we're trying to figure out what world the actual world is. What world are we in? So remember when we talked about the possible worlds theory of belief, we said the idea is that we're trying to figure out which possible world we're in. That's exactly the same way as we can think of what's going on with conversations, where we're trying to exchange information. We're trying to figure out which particular possible world we're in. And the way we do that is basically by taking our context set, which represents the way the world could be, given all the things that we're presupposing. And we want to keep successively narrowing that down until we get to just one world, which is the actual world. So for the context set to only include the actual world, that would represent the fact that we had basically figured out exactly which world that we're in. Now, of course, that never actually happens, but that's what it would be like for us to figure out what world we were in. It would be for the context set to contain an individual world. That, by the way, is a helpful illustration of why smaller sets mean more information. Because if you have the smallest set possible that contains any world, just one world, that means you've figured out everything. Because remember, worlds settle absolutely all the facts. So the picture of what's going on in communication that we can describe now that we've got this idea of the context set is that we have a context set that corresponds to our common ground. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to shrink the context set down right until we have just one world that settles all the facts. That's what it would be for us to figure out together, using our pooled information, what exactly was the case. And on this way of thinking about it, the way the context set gets narrowed down is exactly through assertions. Because if I assert something, I take our old context set, and if you accept what I say, we make it smaller. We go from a context set, so for instance, our context set may or may not settle whether it's raining. There may be some worlds where it's raining and other worlds where it isn't. If I say it's raining and my assertion is successful, we have a new, smaller context set containing only the old worlds where it was raining. So if we keep doing that, if we keep asserting in that way, then theoretically, as long as we're asserting true things, we should get to a context set of just one thing, one world, the actual world, and so we will have achieved the goal of conversation. So given that that's what we're trying to do, we're trying to narrow the context set down so that we figure out together what world we're in three particular principles about when you should and shouldn't assert things look very natural on this theory of assertion. So the first principle is that you should only assert things that differ in their truth value across different worlds. So that means that you should only assert a proposition if it's true in some worlds and false at others. Why would that be? So why should you only assert propositions whose truth value varies across the different worlds in the context set? Well, if you think about it, what it would mean for a proposition to be false in all worlds or to be true in all worlds would mean that you, as parties in the conversation, had already made up your mind about it. So for instance, if a proposition that you were going to assert, say it was already true that in all worlds in the context set it was raining, what that would mean is that we were already presupposing that it was raining. So if all the context worlds are ones where it's raining, then everybody is already presupposing that it's raining. But if everybody's already presupposing that, it makes no sense to assert it, because we already have made up our minds about it. It's not informative for you to say it's raining if everybody's already presupposing that. What about the case where it's false? Well, suppose that it's false in all the worlds in the context set that it's raining. That means that everybody is now presupposing that it's not raining. That's just what it is for it to be false in all worlds in the context set that it's raining. It's for everybody to presuppose that that proposition is false. And of course, you shouldn't go around asserting propositions that everybody takes to be false. Again, that looks like something that's not helpful given the goal of trying to narrow down the context set to the actual world. If everybody presupposes that it's not raining, then you're not going to help in any way to figure out what the actual world is by asserting that it is raining. So putting those two things together, you'll see why we should be asserting propositions whose truth value varies, because those are the propositions that are informative and are not ruled out by what we already presuppose. The second rule I'll mention, but we're not going to talk about it too much because it gets into stuff about presupposition that is going beyond what we're going to be interested in the course. But the second rule just says that you should only assert propositions that have truth values in every world. So the reason why Stalnaker says this is because when people give a theory of what's called sentence presupposition, one way they think about what's going on is that in certain cases, propositions just lack truth values. And what Stalnaker wants to say is that you should only assert sentences that have some truth value in every world or other. As I say, we won't get further into that, but that's what the second rule says. The final rule is going to be the one that we think about the most in the rest of the lecture. And it has a name. It's called sometimes by people uniformity. And the idea of the principle is that you should only assert things using sentences which everybody knows what the sentence says. So if I want to make an assertion using a particular sentence, I should only use that sentence to make the assertion if I know that everybody knows what that sentence expresses. That might seem sort of obvious, and in a sense, it makes a lot of sense. But the reason why it's an important principle to be explicit about is because things get a bit subtle once we start thinking about context sensitivity. So if you're just imagining that we speak a context-insensitive language where no words are context-sensitive, then this principle might look uninteresting. But given the fact that, as we've already seen, certain words are context-sensitive, and thus what exactly they express depends on what kind of context we're in, it's going to be possible, as we'll see in more detail in a moment, to assert or say sentences that express propositions where, because we don't know exactly what the context is like, we don't know exactly what proposition is expressed by that sentence. So because of context sensitivity, there are going to be situations where we actually don't know precisely what proposition a given sentence expresses, because we're ignorant about important features of the context. And basically the rule of uniformity says, don't assert sentences like that. If a sentence expresses various different propositions, but on the basis of the information that we have about the context, you can't figure out which one that is, or some people, at least in the conversation, won't be able to figure out which proposition that is, then don't assert using that sentence. And the basic idea here for why that should be a rule is, well, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to update with a particular proposition, namely the one expressed by your sentence. But how are they going to do that if they don't know what proposition the sentence expresses? They're just not going to be able to update with the proposition your sentence expresses if they just don't know what proposition that is. So given that, and given the fact that what you want to do is you want to add some information to the common ground, you should make sure to assert in a way where everybody knows what they should be updating with. And you might think a necessary condition on that is for you to only say sentences where everybody knows what proposition they express. Okay, so that is an overview of Stalnaker's theory. We have this notion of speaker presupposition. So far, we're understanding it as the speaker believing it and believing that everybody else believes it. Out of speaker presupposition, we define the notion of the common ground. So intuitively, the common ground is this information that everybody accepts, but we're spelling that out by saying that something is common ground, just in case everybody presupposes it. We saw that from the common ground, we can define this notion of a context set. That's a set of worlds compatible with what everybody presupposes. And then we get a view of what we're trying to do with assertions once we have all that in place. What we're trying to do with assertions is we're making a proposal to shrink the context set in a certain way. We're making a proposal to shrink the context set by adding the information corresponding to the proposition we're asserting, and that amounts to just intersecting the context set with the proposition that we asserted. Once that's in place, we have an intuitive picture of what it takes for an assertion to be informative, and from this we can draw out some principles that you might think govern assertion. And the last thing to say about those principles is that, unlike, say, conventional theories or constitutive rule theories, the way that we're thinking about these principles is not that they're like special sort of rules that are in place that govern how we're trying to do assertions. Rather, they're things that are just rational rules for you to follow, given the aims of conversation. The idea is, the reason why these really are rules is because that's what rational people would do if their goal was to try and narrow down the context set to identify the actual world. So it's simplest to see this with the case of the informativity rule, the very first one. If I'm a rational person, and what I'm trying to do is, help us collectively determine which world we're in, you would imagine that I'm going to say only things that were not already presupposed and things which are not collectively presupposed to be false. That looks just like something a rational person would do if their aim was to narrow down the context set in that way. And in fact, the justification for all these rules is taken to be the same. They're not sort of special constitutive rules, they're not conventions, they're rules that follow just because these are what a rational person would do if their aim was to act in the way that we're supposed to when we're communicating with each other on Stalnaker's view. The very last thing we're going to do is draw a picture of what happens with assertions on Stalnaker's picture. So we know what it is for a common ground to accept or be compatible with or to reject a proposition. We've seen pictures of what that's like. Now we're going to see a picture of what happens when you assert something, according to Stalnaker, and your assertion is successful. So let's imagine that we've got some context set, C, and let's imagine that some proposition P is compatible with that context set. We call this P. And now let's ask, well, what would happen if I asserted P and it became accepted? What would the new context set look like? And on Stalnaker's picture, the new context set is simply just the intersection of these two regions. It's the P worlds that overlap with the old context set. In other words, if I assert P and that assertion is accepted, then the new context set, let's call it C prime, is going to be just this shaded region. So when I have a set that's compatible with the context set and I assert it, the new context set is just going to be the result of intersecting those two things together. We can also get a sense by drawing these diagrams of seeing, well, why should we assert propositions that were informative in the sense that we mentioned earlier? Why should we be asserting propositions that just overlap with the set? Rather than entirely including it. So let's imagine that some proposition is already accepted by the common ground. What does that mean? It means that that proposition includes the context set. So we'll say that set is Q. So suppose I were to assert Q and my assertion was accepted. What would the new context set look like? Well, we know how to find it. We take the proposition and we intersect that with C. We find their overlap. But in this case, the case where Q is already accepted, their overlap is just the original context set. The set where everything presupposed is true and where Q is also true is just the original context set. Because remember, we are already accepting Q in this picture. Q is already presupposed. So what happens when you assert a proposition that's already presupposed is that there's no change to the context set. Because the intersection of that context set and the proposition is just the original context set. So you can see in that way that when you assert propositions that are already presupposed, the effect is redundant. Nothing happens. So that's another way of seeing why you shouldn't assert these things, because even if they were accepted, nothing would happen. You would be doing something that had a redundant effect. Finally, we can also see why you shouldn't be asserting propositions that are accepted to be false, that are presupposed to be false. So remember, if we've drawn a picture of Q, we've also drawn a picture of not Q. Not Q is, let's say, this black region, everything outside the black circle. So suppose that that is not Q. So what does the view tell us about what happens when you assert not Q? Well, if I was to assert not Q and it were to be accepted, well, what we would do is we'd find the intersection of our context set and the not Q region. But remember, these two regions are completely distinct. They're completely disjoint, because we said that Q entails C in this part. Or in other words, the context set already includes the information about Q. So if you have two sets and they're completely disjoint, they don't overlap at all, their intersection is just the empty set. That is, the set containing nothing. And when you've got a set of worlds that's empty, what that means is that your information is now contradictory. Because the empty set of worlds just represents, well, basically the impossible proposition. The proposition that can't be true anywhere. So what we see is that if you were to try to add some proposition that's inconsistent with what's being presupposed of the context set, well, your information now, your context set would now just be the empty set. And that would represent the fact that you had accepted a contradiction. Now we're presupposing contradictory information. But of course, contradictory information can't be true, so we would know that something had gone wrong if we got into a state like that. Since we can see that updating with not Q in this situation would lead us to a contradictory state, we can see that updating with not Q is not something we should do. If we already accept Q, we shouldn't assert not Q, because if that got accepted, then our information would just be the empty set, i.e. our information would be contradictory.